Hi there! Welcome back to another video on my channel. Today we are going to be talking about... Wait, can you hear me? Sorry, Mooch is very interested in our video today, apparently. Yeah, sorry. Welcome to another video on my channel. Today we will be talking about another subgenre of horror and something that I kind of stumbled on via threads and as like a new emerging subcategory of horror, which I found really interesting, and that is cozy horror. And I started writing because I write little articles for my blog. So these little episodes that you see of me talking about different subcategories of horror, anything to do with like writing, oftentimes I'll write like a full-length article about them on my website, CassidyVanGundy.com, if you guys are interested in that. The content is similar video form and written form, but you know, some people prefer one or the other. Sorry, I am petting my dog, so she'll behave. Anyway, crazy morning, huh? Anyway, so yeah, if you want to check out those articles, you can. This one isn't up just yet because the article that's talking about cozy horror is still a rough draft, but I have it in front of me just to keep notes because there's like 9 pages worth of content about cozy horror on my laptop. And that's quite more than I usually write. So this should let you know how much people are invested in cozy horror in general. So if you're interested to hear more about this, just keep on watching. Okay, so full disclosure, I do have my laptop out in front of me and I might glance at it occasionally just to make sure I have everything straight. But basically, cozy horror, what is that? Oh my god. The subtitle I have for my article is Finding Comfort with the Creepy, which I thought was pretty good, if I do say so myself. So anyway, cozy horror is relatively recent in terms of the word cozy horror, and I'll get more into that in a minute. But it's relatively recent. The earliest online mentions of cozy horror came about within the past 10 years. On the podcast Books in the Freezer first talked about cozy horror, and what they said about it was, quote, "When you have horror, you can have all the spooky elements, but if you know, for example, you're going to have like a happy ending or low stakes, or even if the stakes are big, it's surrounded by humor or a love interest or things that kind of negate those big stakes." Similarly, there's an online magazine called Nightmare Magazine, and they posted an extensive article on cozy horror called "The H Word: Getting Cozy with Horror" in 2015. And I'm going to be using that magazine article as kind of like a framework to talk about cozy horror, or I use it more when I start giving examples and like using that as my justification for certain examples about cozy horror. So that was written by Jose Cruz. And they say that like for something like a piece of media to fall into cozy horror, it should embody one of 4 elements, right? So the first one is familiarity. So that can be so a quote from their article, right? "While many horror stories grapple with the fear of the unknown, there are elements within and without the narrative of cozy horror stories that bring the work into question into a safer, more knowable realm, allowing for a sense of comfort to take hold." So for me, the familiarity can present in a bunch of different ways. It could be like something like a little bit more personal, like rewatchability for somebody, but also could be setting, time frame, nostalgia, you know. And some of the questions I posed in the article regarding familiarity, like, is this something you engage with every year for Halloween, right? Does it have plenty pleasant memories associated with this work for the reader or viewer? Are the main characters kind and welcoming and friendly in spite of everything going on? That's also something to consider too. So the second category that cozy horror falls into is sensuousness. I can read the quote from Cruz again, but basically this is like more atmospheric stuff. If it feels cozy or if it gives off the right vibes, according to Cruz. He argues that in the sense, the work of cozy horror literizes the theme by portraying soothing moments of peace amidst the terror, crackling hearths, frothy tavern mugs, snuggling up in camping tents. So yeah, this is like ASMR type elements within the story, whether that be visually or like in the book. This isn't necessarily cozy horror, but something that brings to mind for me is like the cozy fantasy stories, legends and lattes for sure, because that's all like centered around a coffee shop, right? Which is very soothing for a lot of folks. But yeah, so that element could be present in the story as well. I think this is really easy to do if you have your story set in some like small town, or maybe like New England in the fall, or Halloween trick-or-treating type things, where there's a lot you can do to bring in like the sights and the smells and the overall vibes of like a classic familiar holiday to folks. The third category that can help classify something as cozy horror is distance. So this is more of like the immediate threat doesn't feel so immediate. It doesn't feel so in your face. There is something that sets apart distance between you and the viewer slash reader. So according to Cruz, he says that the difference here is that the primary threat within the work of cozy horror is almost always something that the audience could feel like they're in no relatively immediate danger or having to endure themselves. So yeah, basically what I said. So for me, this is something that like could easily be pulled off with setting. So if a piece of media is set way in the past, obviously that can't help hurt the reader now. And likewise, same for the future. If the threat is happening way in the future, it is not in the reader's present timeline, so they don't have anything to worry about. You could also do this by setting it in like a different town, a different planet, a different country, whatever. So that puts some like physical distance between the reader and the threat itself as well. And yeah, this just kind of helps because then it could still be scary for what's happening to the main character, but it's no longer scary for the viewer because again, it's not like it's happening in their own backyard, which is something I used to tell myself all the time as a kid who got into scary movies. I was like, oh, well, I don't need to be scared because this is a haunted house in like Connecticut or something, and I don't live in Connecticut. Like that was a way to trick myself into not being as scared. So, it's an effective thing, and now it's being serialized within cozy horror. So, the last element is fun. According to Cruz, fun should be present in the story. This was kind of talked about earlier when they were talking about comedy or a love interest or whatever. But basically, within cozy horror, you're kind of not looking for any traumatizing events to happen to you, but maybe more, not necessarily a light scare, but like you're still trying to find fun and entertainment within the piece itself. You don't want something that just is like shocking for shock value necessarily. So there's some examples of certain types of extreme horror that may or may not fit in, but also I would argue cozy horror is extremely subjective. So if somebody finds fun within that, then yeah, sure, that's what's cozy for them. It's not necessarily cozy for everybody else, but it is what it is. So it's important to know because some people do like enjoy seeing like violent scenes on screen, especially if they're like more creative violent things and they think that's fun. So to each their own, I guess, but whatever you find fun should be present within whatever you're trying to deem as cozy horror. So basically, I have some examples, and I picked these because I personally find them to be part of cozy horror. You may agree or disagree, and that's fine. If you do disagree or agree with me, you can let me know in the comments down below. That's fine, and we can have like a discussion about it. But the first piece of media that I thought like immediately came to mind when I heard about this concept of cozy horror was Over the Garden Wall. Now, I rewatch this show every year for fall, multiple times. I love Over the Garden Wall. It is a animated miniseries through Cartoon Network originally, and it is about two half brothers who are kind of navigating this like woods that's like in a limbo like place basically, and they're trying to get back home. So a lot of like whimsical weird stuff happens, and there is a looming threat where the beast tries to basically break their spirits to get them to turn into elder trees or like certain trees, which would keep them trapped there forever, right? So that's basically the plot of Over the Garden Wall. There's a lot of other characters that I didn't mention, but I think this falls under cozy horror because it's just vibes. Like, so the art style of Over the Garden Wall, if you haven't seen it, is gorgeous, and it reminds me a lot of like American Impressionist paintings, but that's just my thing. I think the art technically is more inspired by like vintage Halloween cards and New England foliage in the fall, which is like what I said earlier about New England. It's very atmospheric. New England is beautiful in the fall, and I was lucky enough to live in Boston for a time and get to experience that for myself. But yes, so so it's spooky. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of work to look at, and I think that's where the sensuousness really comes in. For me, it's super familiar because it's a show that came out when I was younger. I can't remember what year it came out, but I want to say like the Adventure Time era is like when all this kind of stuff came out. So when I was younger, this is when it came out. So there's this like nostalgia element for me that brings in the familiarity. It's fun because the entire time, despite everything scary that's happening to these kids, they have to remain positive and upbeat or whimsy, or else the beast is going to get a hold of them. And there's like comedic elements because again, it's like a kid's cartoon, but I find the younger brother especially to be pretty cute and funny. So it hits all four of those elements. And if you haven't seen Over the Garden Wall, I really recommend it, especially for spooky times. That spooky times that doesn't feel like so super duper scary. It's still like eerie and stuff, but it's not like gory or anything like that. Okay. Anyway, oh, that was kind of sexy, girl. Anyway, so my next pick for cozy horror could be a little bit controversial. It's not as obvious as the first one that I picked, but I would classify it as cozy horror. So I put What We Do in the Shadows on here. I don't know if any of you have seen the show. It's a very much an adult show. It's not a child's show. I know I mentioned a child's show initially, but this one is very raunchy. Don't let your kids watch it. And it's also pretty gory at times. So you might be like, Cassie, why the heck is this cozy horror then? Especially since it takes place in like New York City in Staten Island. That's not the most, cozy vibes place in the world. But I would argue that this really hits comedic fun. This is more of like a horror comedy, and there are romantic subplots throughout the story. But God, it's just hilarious. So this show is based off of a film with the same name. Well, not really. It's like inspired by, I guess. The Taika Waititi made both. Okay, so the movie originally is about four vampires. It's a mockumentary of four vampires that live in New Zealand and their roommates, and it kind of follows them along as they try to navigate the modern world. Right. Of course, that's like a different type of humor that might not translate well across the pond. So they actually made a show, a U.S. based show, with a similar presence as that movie. So they made a show with the same presence as the movie, and it is about a group of vampires living in Staten Island in this like really traditional Gothic looking house that stands out a little bit with the rest of like the cityscape. So it's already funny. But even the characters are a little bit funnier. So there's Nandor the Relentless. He's like an Ottoman warrior, king, prince guy. And there's a couple there, Laszlo and Nadia, who are both European, and they're like polyamorous, and they're pansexual or whatever. And they just get into all sorts of hijinks. And then there's also an energy vampire who's really bland and boring named Colin Robinson. And he, I feel like, is the unsung hero of the show. I mean, they all stand out in their own way. They're all hilarious. And then they also live with a familiar named Guillermo who really wants to be a vampire one day. And I'm not going to go too much into Guillermo because his character development is kind of like a crucial plot point for the show. So I'm not going to spoil anything for you. But yeah, so I feel like this hits in different ways. So you have the familiarity where we all know what New York is like. It's set in modern times. So you kind of have this knowledge of what kind of people you're going to interact with. Girl, are you okay? My dog's being weird. Anyway, so you have that. It's, I would say it's still sensuous because you have sensuous and familiar. You have the traditional vampire tropes, them dressing very gothically. Other vampires come in and out to visit them, and you have the need to feed and all that. But it's just funny because they can't really operate on their. It's like they wouldn't be able to do very well in New York without Guillermo's help or influence to kind of like act as like a guide to like how to be normal. Um, so that's really funny. And it kind of relieves the threat a little bit because then you're like not super scared of them, despite them being violent and like they could be easily overpower you. They're just kind of dumb in a way, or they're like inept in a way, I guess is a better word for it. So I love this show. If you want to check it out, both the movie and the show are made by Taika Waititi, and it's his kind of humor. So it's very, very, very funny. But yeah, I think it's a niche taste. I don't think it's for everyone. I think they're having their last season this year, so I'm a little sad about that. But yeah, I would put this in cozy horror for me, despite it being bloody at times and stuff. It's just so funny. And it's kind of like reminds me of Tucker and Dale versus Evil. That one's like super gory too, but that one's just so funny that like it's not, there's no real threat because of how comedic the horror is, if that makes sense. Okay, my third example I wanted to give kind of relates a little bit more to Over the Garden Wall. It's another piece of kids media, but it's a little bit scarier than Over the Garden Wall, and that's Coraline. I think we could all agree that Coraline is definitely a mood watch, or you rewatch it like when it's like spooky season. It's super atmospheric. The animation is so cool, and I don't know, it just gives Halloween vibes. So I don't. If you haven't seen Coraline, Coraline is a story about a girl named Coraline, obviously, Coraline Jones, and she moves across the country, and she lives in the Pink Palace. She's got no friends, and she's really upset with her family because everything's boring. Relatable. Anyway, so she gets enticed. She finds this little door that leads her to an alternate reality where, like, her other mother and other father, but her other mother specifically is the one that's kind of in charge of things. And she gets her dream life, everything she like wished for. She plays fun games. Her parents are more attentive to her. She eats all of her favorite foods. Her neighbors are cooler than what they really are. Her mom makes her a garden. So like all this awesome stuff is happening. And then I come to find out that the mother kind of has malicious intentions, and if Coraline was to stay in this world, then she has to sacrifice something pretty big in order to stay. So yeah, that's basically the plot. But again, this hits cozy horror criteria for me because familiarity. Watched it as a kid, watched it every year. I was like 14 when it came out. So it's also based off a children's book by Neil Gaiman, and the children's book, from what I understand, is a lot scarier than the movie. That there's more horror elements in the actual children's book than in this rendition of this movie. In fact, it's a little bit controversial because I found this story and I thought it was really interesting. So there was some debate on whether it should be marketed as a children's book because of how scary it was. And so, in order to test it, I think Neil Gaiman gave the book to either the publisher's daughter or the editor's daughter or something like that. And the daughter claimed like she wasn't scared by it, so then it was okay. So that's why they marketed it to children. But it turns out that the little girl did this out of pride. Okay, sorry. The little girl did this out of pride, and she didn't want to be embarrassed, and she was actually really scared. There's the story. So yeah, so Familiarity, this came out a while ago. It's also a children's book that came out in like 2001. So it already has a mass audience and people who liked it when they were younger, and now they're enjoying it as adults, and they can share it on to their kids, right? There's sensuousness. The animation is fantastic. I love stop motion animation. Some people don't. They think it's like uncanny valley type stuff. But I enjoy it, so I thought it was aesthetically pleasing. I mean, they do the food thing, the garden thing. It's all like, for lack of a better term, like pleasure-based census type stuff. And then what else? It's fun. It's whimsical. It's for children. There's like jokes in between, and distance. Oh, because you can't really feel scared because the only time you can get ensnared by the other mother or whatever is if you live in the Pink Palace, right? So don't eat Spider-Man. So if you don't live in the Pink Palace, then yeah, you're fine. So that's how it hits on all 4 accounts for me, at least. Anyway, I got 2 more examples for you, and then we'll go back to some pushback and conclusion, just like a little tapping in point. So the second thing, scary stories to tell in the dark, very similar to Coraline, except the horror I feel like is turned up quite a bit. It is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was originally a kids horror anthology that was published in the 80s, and the sketches on it were really, really scary. I don't know how they got that past. Like, it was like charcoal drawings of the monsters, and they were really messed up looking. But anyway, so the book originally went back way back then, and then in 2019 they made a movie on Netflix, I think, based on this anthology, right? And the movie itself is pretty gory too. There is a reference. There are just warnings. So violence, murder, cannibalism, and disfigurement, and some bugs. So it's pretty intense for a kids franchise. And again, this was an example I wanted to include to show that a lack of gore does not necessarily mean cozy horror, or lack of horror does not necessarily equate to cozy horror either. It is a familiar franchise, like I said, similar to Coraline, where people have grown up with it. It originated as children's media and then, became available for the wider audience. It's fun in the thing of like, look how scary that is. And I think the fun of it too is in the taboo of it, because this book series, people have been trying to ban it multiple times. And I feel like with each attempt at that, like it only adds to the allure for a preteen to pick this up. Technically, it's middle grade fiction. So that's how they've been around getting around the book ban, is because they're like, oh, middle grade should be able to handle this kind of stuff. Um, I'm not parents, so I don't know, but but yeah. So that kind of adds to the allure and the fun of these stories, is like how it's like being scared by something as a kid, as opposed to really being terrorized by something, or like remembering the feelings of how scared you were as a child and then being like, and it's not scary anymore, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I am putting this one, it's a loose one, I think, for cozy horror. But again, I think it has the rewatchability. I think it could easily be something you watch every year for Halloween. It takes place on Halloween. I think a lot of movies that take place in Halloween, like Hocus Pocus and stuff, can fit into cozy horror. But I just wanted to illustrate that you don't need to be not scary to be cozy horror, because that's a critique that comes up later on in this essay/video. So yeah. And then my last one I want to talk about, just because it's one of my favorites, is The Twilight Zone. I think this is perfect cozy horror. It's super atmospheric. This show's technically like sci-fi thriller horror. Not every episode qualifies as horror, I think. But it's super atmospheric. It's dated, it's black and white, so there's no immediate threat. There's distance because of the time period. It's like a 1960s rendition of futuristic events, or even though it has social critiques that are still relevant for today, unfortunately. It I don't know, it still feels like encapsulated in a way, so it feels a little bit safer, as opposed to if you were somebody watching this in the 60s and this was your worldview and reality, right? Also, I think they're just kind of fun in general. They're not like super violent or anything, but I think they're more fun because it's such a creative show and the episodes have such creative messaging. Also, The Twilight Zone is like super famous, so it's very easy to become familiar with that franchise as a whole. They even have it right at Disney World at one point, so I think it fits a cozy horror. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the pushback against cozy horror. There's multiple elements to this, and I actually cite an article that's kind of, I didn't realize was like pretty infamous or controversial, so oopsies. But there's a Mary Sue article that talks about the backlash against cozy horror, and they are very critical of people who aren't embracing this subgenre. And so I'm just reading a quote from them. It says, "The heart of the problem, it seems to me, that many people see horror as an endurance contest. The more viscerally terrifying something is, the reasoning goes, the better it is at being horror." Other people have added onto this. I've read multiple articles, and another quote from a different one says, "Terror is only a metric by which horror is judged, and the more terrified of your reader can stand to be, the better horror fan that they are. If you cover your eyes, you failed at loving horror." So I think that's a fair criticism to make. I mean, there's definitely things that I can't really stomach personally. Sorry, Glassman was the one that wrote the Mary Sue article. So those two quotes came from the same article. Sorry for the misleading thing. But I think that rings true, because I know for myself there's certain things that I just can't stomach, or there's certain things that are, for lack of a better term, because people have overused this term quite a bit, triggering for me. Or if you are somebody who's been through something, and you're in therapy to try to help regulate your was it nervous and endocrine systems or whatever, there's some things that are going to put you in a fight or flight mode, right? And I have some of those, and I try to look for movies that don't have graphic depictions of like SA, or especially SA with children. Like I can't do that. So I've been not necessarily called, I've tried to like criticize that before online, and I've talked about this before, but I tried to criticize that before online, and I went viral, and I went on the wrong side of the horror community, and I just got obliterated with people making fun of me and insulting me and doing whatever, saying I don't know anything, when I do in fact do research about horror and write about horror, because I feel like horror is such an interesting way to view the dominant fears of a society, and like what those fears turn into over time as like different political situations arise or changes in society happen. I can go on and on about that, right? Like from a academic standpoint, I'm very interested in horror. So it kind of sucks to be invalidated just because like there's certain things that I just avoid for my own mental health, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy other types of movies, or I don't enjoy like quiet horror, atmospheric horror, or like more spooky supernatural stuff than I do that's like flat out gore. And I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. And I don't think those people should be counted out of the horror community at all. So something else, I read a separate article. This is where the separate article comes in. That was a criticism of this article, sort of in just support, but also like criticizing certain things used, because there was very flippant language used in the original Mary Sue article. But anyway, so Cora Bolhart wrote the other ones that I'm quoting, and she cites someone that's been very vocal and critical about cozy horror. So I'm just going to read the whole thing for you guys. So sorry. But yeah, so McNeil's main point is that he believes that horror should make people uncomfortable and that cozy horror is therefore an oxymoron. So they think that by definition, horror can't be cozy. Okay. Later on, there is discussion about, so she quotes him because he claims that cozy horror is gentrifying the horror space. So he views horror as something that is sacred, and that somehow the sanctity of horror is questioned once people who aren't horror fans come into the space and demand things to be more tame. That's his viewpoint. So she's criticizing that viewpoint, and this is a block quote. Basically, the worry seems to be that since horror has experienced a resurgence in popularity following the massive crash of the genre in the 1990s, more writers and big publishers will move into horror fiction, and that horror will become sanitized and bland. Cozy horror is apparently viewed as a vanguard of this process, the first mainstream coffee shop or wine bar to open in the neighborhood to run with a gentrification metaphor. Though personally, I find this metaphor hugely problematic because gentrification does untold harm in the real world by displacing and destroying whole neighborhoods. People writing and publishing books some folks don't like is no way comparable to the real world harmed by gentrification. So I think that gentrification comment that was done by the original guy was probably just like hyperbole or just like an exaggeration. People tend to blow things out of proportion. For me, this feels like gatekeeping. These sorts of comments to me feel very gatekeeping, and this happens within every subgroup or like niche interest group, where they feel like if the normies come in, things will get ruined. This attitude is very prevalent with a lot of fan communities as well. I don't think that's inherently true. It's this idea of like if something is popular, then the quality of it must suck, because only true genius can be appreciated by the few. I don't necessarily agree with this. I think we need to give the masses more credit. Sometimes, yeah, popular stuff is garbage. There's like some things that are popular that I don't like, but there's plenty of popular things that I do like. And I think that's just kind of this like weird hipster mentality that is just parading its intellectualism, but in reality, they're just killjoys. That's my opinion. Hot take. Anyway, so that's how I kind of saw these comments about cozy horror, about watering down horror, and some of the examples I gave. I would say that for some, violence can be a core component of cozy horror because that's what goes under the fun part for them, right? For them, not for everybody, you know. But that's what makes this coziness so unique to folks, and I'll go into that a little bit more. I argued that the Call of Cthulhu and other Lovecraftian works can be classified as cozy horror due to their emphasis on the description of events or lack of description, truthfully. But the sensuousness, it depends on more sensuality or like the environment than actual direct action, you know? Likewise, plenty of early and contemporary gothic and supernatural horror would fit under cozy horror, many of which are written by femme horror fans. And that's important to note because the Mary Sue article distinctly mentioned that they view that there's a gender component to this. They feel because they wrote because many female or femme fans enjoy cozy horror is getting the same sort of criticisms as like romance and like YA, like it's watered down versions of writing or art, right? I just wanted to point out that like it's not as black and white as that. Like there's plenty of male readers or masculine presenting folks who enjoy romance and YA. just as like there's many horror fan, like hardcore horror fans that are femme presenting. So you can't just like write it out altogether, especially when women and femme people read a lot more than men. They're going to be present in these like book communities specifically. I don't know if it's the same for movies, but for books specifically, then yeah, you can't diminish the work of like the presence of femme people in lit spaces. I do think though that there is, and I've been very critical of this, that there is lots of misogyny within the horror community, and sometimes that comes out depicted in media, and sometimes a lot of that comes from fans itself. So while I do think the comments are valid, I don't think this person articulated it in the right sort of way, and that's like something else that could be discussed further, Um, so my thoughts on this, like the conclusion of like why is like cozy horror so popular now, like what are my personal thoughts about it. It makes sense to me that this idea of coziness is coming out in a post-pandemic society, right? Like we lived through a collective trauma. This was like a world of so many millions of people died. This was a world-changing event for sure, for sure. And we were experiencing so many emotions of confusion, anger, frustration, helplessness, all sorts of these really hard feelings, right? That some people haven't even processed yet. So it's understandable that people would look at coziness and comfort as this like desirable thing in a world that doesn't provide that space naturally anymore. We live in a super hyper capitalistic society. There's a recession going on here in the US. It's hard for people to afford homes anymore or basic necessities. So you see this rise in like, this is a separate thing, but you see a lot rise in like cottagecore aesthetics or trad wife stuff, traditional, all that shit's coming back. And like that's part of fascism or a natural response that fascism brings about. I don't want to get too political in this video, but so that is like an unattainable lifestyle for many people. Many people cannot get their basic needs met, and they're living in a constant state of hypervigilance because they don't have this sort of financial security or physical security anymore that people used to have, right? So for me, it's natural that these cozy mysteries, cozy horror, cozy fantasies are all being so popularized right now. I mean, it was coziness is like a trend online on TikTok and social media spaces, but it makes sense for like the unattainable lifestyle, right? It used to be people wanted luxurious items and they wanted to grind and get that super status, right? But now it's kind of inverted because of how far gone, because of the state of the world around us right now, with all the political turmoil and the violence and everything going on right now. It's really intense. So for me, I think cozy horror gives people a unique opportunity to relive some of those dangerous experiences, but in a controlled setting. So, like you get enough threat so that you can relive those feelings, but then you understand that there's going to be like a happy ending or something, and it helps you have a sense of gaining control over those experiences or those feelings that you're reliving. Um, and I think this could be really healing for some folks and really cathartic. And I think that's why it's been more popular. And in my opinion, I'm not gonna like criticize somebody for wanting to feel those comforts again, um, and joy and feelings of safety when all this is considered, right? Like I'm not gonna yuck someone's yum, knowing all this contextual information that we can assume, right? Um, Also, I just wanted to point out that even though cozy is like a relatively new buzzword that's being used, a lot of the staples of cozy horror kind of translate back to quiet horror and other atmospheric horrors that I mentioned before and I've done other videos on. So, is this like really new? No, yes and no, because there's been like horror comedies and uh, dark romances, or supernatural romances. Yeah, the romance girlies have so many subgenres of like spooky stuff in them, and like that's a whole other video I can make some other time. But so like all these things have happened. It's just a new way for folks to categorize this to be able to better find that feeling that they're chasing, in my opinion. But yeah, that's basically the gist of everything I wanted to say. I'm sorry if this video is a little bit longer than normal, but I hope you found it to be informative, and I will let you guys know when the article goes live because, I basically covered most of the information that would have been in the article. But you know, in case you'd rather read it, I'm gonna have it online too. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to me talk. Let me know down below what your thoughts on cozy horror are, if you've made the same sort of connections I have. And until next time, thanks. Bye.